Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyranor as always, and boy what have I got myself into. I promised this last summer that I would do a video on Illidan's Stormrage and my opinion on him once his story was done, and I suppose that time has come. But this is probably one of the hardest videos I'm ever going to do. Now before I begin, since this is almost certainly going to be a very contentious video, and my opinion on the character is definitely not in the mainstream, this video represents just my opinion on Illidan's Stormrage. My opinion is not going to be influenced by the opinion of others on the character, in this case apparently the majority of people. You are entirely free to disagree with my opinion, and to be honest I think it's a good thing to have a reasonable discussion rather than everyone agreeing with me. And if you feel Illidan is the greatest character Warcraft has ever created, then good for you, and I mean that. If you feel Illidan is a roaming trash fire of a character, that's a valid opinion as well. Now, I honestly considered splitting this into 3, arguably 4 separate videos, but I decided that would just be too confusing for the viewers. The reason this is a difficult video to make is that Illidan is not really a single character, but rather 3, arguably even 4 separate characters who happen to share the same body at different times. What I mean by that is that Blizzard really likes retconning Illidan's personality. I don't mean to say that they retcon actual events in his life or that the character develops and his personality changes as a result, but rather they have changed his personality almost entirely, at least twice, to the point where it is an entirely different character. Specifically, to put it in simple terms, there's the Illidan from the War of the Ancients novels and from Warcraft 3, who was a power-hungry anti-hero. Then there's the Illidan from Burning Crusade, who is pretty much completely bonkers and a villain with pretty much no redeeming characteristics. Then there's the Illidan from the Illidan novel and Legion, who was, so to say, a good guy all along. In fact, he keeps reminding you of how stupid we were for actually believing he was a bad guy, to the point where he basically became a trailer fodder character. And even this particular latest iteration of Illidan I could split into 2 characters, which I will come to when it will be relevant. And these 3, arguably 4 personalities don't really gel together. They really are very different people, and talking about all of them at the same time is basically like talking about 3 different people who happen to share a few similarities at the same time. It's also a bit difficult to talk about Illidan's history and lore, because a lot of his backstory has been altered, not changed outright mind you, to fit his latest personality. For example, the time during the War of the Ancients when he drained his subordinate mages of power while fighting the Legion. Before, this was just another example of him being power hungry, and Illidan himself only thought of how much power he gained while doing so, and how awesome it is to have power and to be powerful. In Legion, this event was meant the moment Illidan realized that sacrifices had to be made to defeat the Legion. So you see what I mean? The events themselves were not changed outright, not exactly, rather they were altered subtly to make the new narratives work. And this is part of the reason why I'm not sure how to approach the subject of Illidan. If I go through his backstory chronologically, like I did with Sylvanas, every step of the way I would have to stop and say, this is how this event influenced the first phase of his character, this is how I feel about it, and this is how this event influenced the latter phase of his character, and this is how I feel about it, which really would take way too much time, and to be perfectly honest, I'd probably lose track of what my original point was eventually. So instead I'm going to talk about Illidan in a real life chronology, aka I will talk about his portrayal in Warcraft 3 and its expansion, then the War of the Ancients trilogy, then Burning Crusade, then his various cameos in the latter expansions, and then the Illidan novel before concluding with Legion. Now, as I've mentioned, we were first introduced to Illidan in Warcraft 3, where Tyrande releases him from prison. He goes to absorb the skull of Gul'dan and is banished because of that. and then he gathers a relatively ragtag group of people, aka a bunch of Naga, demons, Blood Elves, and Broken, initially accepts an offer to destroy the Scourge under orders from Kil'jaeden. Then when he fails, stays on the run from the Legion for a while, then he's caught and serves the Legion once again in trying to destroy the Frozen Throne. Warcraft 3, along with its expansion, really actually surprising for an RTS game generally speaking, created a very interesting character in regards to Illidan at this point. He was clearly serving only his own interests. He wasn't evil, but he wasn't good either. He helped both the good guys and the bad guys in order to serve his own interests. And what's also interesting was that he seemed really human, so to say. Not in the sense that he was a flawed character, although he was, but rather that we see him have very human emotions rather than the more black and white characters of, say, for example, Kil'jaeden or Kael'thas, or on the other end of the spectrum, Malfurion or Thrall. We see him be angry at his brother, overjoyed at being released by Tyrande. We see him bonding with Kael'thas. We see his fear of Kil'jaeden. Unlike some, not all, but some of the other characters of Warcraft 3, which were more archetypes, Illidan really seemed like, so to say, an actual effing human being. In a way, I suppose you could say this was the main thing which I liked about Illidan's first characterization, aka in Warcraft 3 and in the War of the Ancients trilogy, who was an extremely flawed but very relatable, so to say, individual. Unlike, for example, Malfurion, who always will be on the side of the good guys and will always be altruistic and a compassionate individual, Illidan can be both kind and cruel. He can be both altruistic and selfish, but the most important thing was that you definitely always understood why he did the things he did, and you could argue that many of us would have gone down the same path that he did. In regards to his portrayal in the War of the Ancients trilogy, those books are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, though overall I have to say I enjoyed them. In regards to Illidan himself, they really did a good job of setting up the character we would see in Warcraft 3, as we see him developing from an ambitious, impatient youth enamored with Tyrande to a power-hungry and nonetheless well-intentioned warrior, so to say. One interesting thing to note is that I've heard some people say that he turned completely evil in the War of the Ancients trilogy, and Blizzard made up later on that he turned back to the good side. But actually, if you read the novel, Illidan does return to the good side, and he does say that he was just pretending to be on the side of the bad guys. So no, that little part was not added later on by Blizzard to retcon his personality. It was there from the beginning. Didn't stop them from retconning a bunch of other stuff in the novel later though, but that is another story. All in all, I have to say that this original portrayal of Illidan is honestly my favorite and is what makes him rank high on my favorite characters list. As I've already mentioned, I really liked how grounded and relatable the character was, and I have to give props to the people that portrayed him as such, namely the people who developed the story of Warcraft 3 and the author of the War of the Ancients trilogy, Richard Knack. Now moving on to the second portrayal, the dumpster fire of a portrayal that was Burning Crusade. It's really so bad that they had to write an entire book to explain the nonsense of it. Burning Crusade, taking the expansion on its own and without including the Illidan novel and later stuff we learn, portrays Illidan as a completely evil villain, when he does appear, that is. Illidan himself doesn't really appear that much during the expansion, but most of the bad stuff that goes on in Outland and you have to solve is either his fault directly or indirectly, or the fault of the Legion. In fact, pretty much the only thing that he was doing in Burning Crusade, the only good thing rather, again, in the in-game expansion, not a novelization, was that he was also fighting against the Legion, like us. I don't think there is really a point in dwelling on this second portrayal. It was so bad that Blizzard didn't just retcon it, they outright stated that it was bad. At the time, they tried to justify this completely evil side of Illidan by saying that the fact that he lost the duel against Arthas drove him completely crazy. Which, I mean, sure, Illidan wasn't exactly the most mentally stable of people to begin with, but come on, he's that mad over losing to Arthas. If it were Maiev or Malfurion or even Kil'jaeden, it might be a bit more understandable, but Illidan barely spoke to Arthas twice. Anyway, let's just move on. Illidan's portrayal in the Burning Crusade expansion was bad, and I'm glad everyone decided to move on from it. As to the handful of times he's appeared in expansions between Burning Crusade and Legion, they're alright, so to say. Those appearances, cameos really, fit with either of the three characterizations we have of Illidan. Probably the most interesting one was the Warlock Green Fire quest chain in Mists of Pandaria, where we find out that Illidan had a place of great arcane power in the Black Temple, which he used to cure the demons under his command, and which he kept hidden from the Blood Oaths. Which is, interesting enough, he probably kept it hidden because of Kael'thas' betrayal, and although other than his popularity in fandom, there were pretty much no signs that Illidan would ever return at this point in time, and these were at most a few nice cameos. Now let's get to the real contentious issue, namely Illidan's portrayal in the Illidan novel and in Legion. Now, as you've seen so far, I didn't dislike Illidan at this point in time. In fact, he was one of my favorite characters in all of Warcraft, leaving aside the Burning Crusade portrayal. I was genuinely excited for his return and was curious to see what they would do with him. Starting off with the Illidan novel, which came out before Legion and was meant to justify all that he did during Burning Crusade. In my opinion, it's not really that great of a novel. I found it to be rather weak actually, but at the very least it did do a very good job of reinterpreting everything that happened during Burning Crusade and changing the meaning of events entirely to show that actually Illidan was a good guy all that time and all he did was for the sake of fighting the Burning Legion. Now, I'm not entirely against the idea that all this time Illidan was actually a good guy, and the times he did really questionable things was actually in order to help the greater good, etc. And in my opinion, this development is especially fine if it meets the following two criteria. 1. The new characterization is handled competently and tells a good story. And 2. If some events or interpretations of events have to be changed for those specific events, we should not have already had Illidan's version of the story. And I think this is why I like Illidan's portrayal in the Illidan novel, but I don't really like it in Legion. The Illidan novel, for all its faults, did tell a good enough story, and the events it changed or reinterpreted, namely Burning Crusade, we did not have Illidan's version of those events. Illidan's story in Legion is, honestly, in my humble opinion, fan-servicey at best and nonsensical at worst, in regards to the first point. As to the second point, the backstory events which were changed or reinterpreted by Legion, for pretty much all of them we already had Illidan's perspective on the situation. So really it's no longer a clever twist or multiple clever twists like one could argue for the Illidan novel, rather it's just an outright retcon. Now, one aspect that needs to be discussed when talking about Illidan's characterization in the Illidan novel is the idea of him being the chosen one, who will destroy the Sith once and for all and all that. This is where I'm really in the minority here. Was rather, honestly okay with the idea. I wasn't really enthused about it or anything, but I didn't hate it. It wasn't the first time Warcraft had a MacGuffin to solve their problems, and it certainly won't be the last. Honestly, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I personally would have preferred that he had stayed the chosen one, because if he is not the chosen one of this particular story, then the players are. And I dislike the idea of the player, the nameless hero, being the keystone upon which depends the fate of the world, especially in World of Warcraft. In World of Warcraft, the players are the biggest Deus Ex Machina, the biggest MacGuffin there is. We're worse than Malfurion at the end of Warcraft 3, we're worse than Thrall in Cataclysm, because at least Thrall hasn't taken down an actual god before. I'll get into this later in the video, but this is perhaps my biggest dislike when it comes to the idea of Illidan not being the chosen one. The fact that if it's not him, then it's the player. Now moving on to the actual Legion expansion itself. Oh no, it's pretty much impossible to judge the changes to Illidan's backstory without looking at what they actually did with his character later on in Legion. Otherwise, looking at these changes on their own, my opinion pretty much is they retcon some stuff. I don't like that they keep retconning stuff. I've moved on. Now, as to his portrayal and actions in Legion, I'll be looking in detail at each of them, but to sum it all up, I found him to be sometimes, rarely, interesting. I found him to be really frustrating at many other times, and even more times than both of those combined, I just found him to be trailer fodder, something you would put in the movie, or in the game in this case, just because it's cool rather than because it would contribute to the story. For most of his screen time in Legion, Illidan has either been a smug I told you so tit, or was off saying weird or quote-unquote cool stuff, things that made pretty much every player of World of Warcraft except myself apparently swoon. Illidan, in my humble opinion, seemed in Legion like he was always starring in a really bad rendition of a Shakespearean play. He was always Henry V leading the charge, even then when there was no actual charge to lead, or he was Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon even when there was no river in front of him. That's not a real person or a believable character. That's Shakespeare's rendition of Henry V or Julius Caesar, and a bad one at that. Taking as an example his first actual alive appearance in Legion, him being resurrected at the end of the Nighthold raid and killing Gul'dan. To be perfectly honest, that scene was exactly what I wanted out of Illidan being revived, and exactly how I wished Gul'dan would die. The fact that at the end he holds the skull of Gul'dan and crushes it, I would go so far as to say that was actually really clever from Blizzard. And then he stands up and says, "You have seen what I have seen, you know what we face. Now, mortals, follow me into the abyss." I've exaggerated a little bit, but you get what I mean. What in real life person would say that naturally? It's not necessarily the words itself which are bad enough, but rather how he says it and the way he spells out every word. Even if you look at, say, Malfurion in Warcraft 3. Malfurion in Warcraft 3 also said some pretty cringy stuff, but oftentimes Illidan went completely ham when it was his turn to speak in Legion. And I'm not blaming Illidan's voice actor here, I think he did a fine job with what he was given. I'm blaming Illidan's direction and characterization. Almost everything he says in Legion sounds like it came out of a speech or out of a Shakespearean play. Anyway, moving on from my general impression of him, let's talk about his actual story in Legion. I honestly liked his character dynamic with Maiev, what little of it there was, though admittedly it's what you would expect to hear from the two of them together. The only other character he really interacts a lot with throughout Legion is Velen, and honestly I have rather mixed feelings about it. Honestly, I find it a lot more interesting from Velen's point of view and seeing how the Prophet develops as a character. Illidan's interaction with him for the most part is him continuing to spout his Shakespearean script at him, along with the occasional "I told you so" line. The two of them interacting was honestly really interesting, and I would have liked to see more of it in Legion. But to be honest, again, I only found it appealing because of the development and possible implications it meant for Velen, rather than because of Illidan himself. I suppose the next thing to talk about would be him opening the portal to Argus. I don't really have a problem with that. It's pretty much part of his MO to do crazy dangerous stuff like that, no matter the characterization. And I would actually say that his line, that sometimes the hand of fate must be forced, was a nice homage to when he first said that in Warcraft 3, especially because he said it right as he was about to do something really dangerous then too. I did make a video laughing about this particular decision of his, but they pretty much just addressed a lot of my concerns later on. The next moment, and probably the one where I'm really going to go against popular opinion here, was the moment where Illidan kills Xe'ra. I've talked about before why I would rather have Illidan continue to be the chosen one from a structural point of view, namely why I would want him to be the chosen one instead of the players. But let's talk about it from an in-character perspective, and I'm only talking about Illidan's perspective rather than Xe'ra's, since that's an entirely different topic. Illidan, in pretty much every one of his characterizations, has been portrayed as power-hungry. In this latest portrayal of his character, the Legion one, this hunger for power has all been for the purpose of defeating the Burning Legion. That's fine, that's good so far. So why would he refuse this power now? Illidan always talks about sacrificing himself to defeat the Burning Legion. Why not perform this last sacrifice, a sacrifice which is infinitely easier and more beneficial to him than all of the ones he has been forced to make so far? In the Illidan novel, Illidan is shown how powerful he would become if he accepted the power of the light, the power that Xe'ra is actually offering him in Legion. He would basically destroy the Burning Legion all by himself. He definitely knows that he would gain immensely in power if he accepted Xe'ra's gift. I've heard some people say it's because he regrets his actions until now, and he wishes that he would not have made all the sacrifices that he made so far, and he doesn't want to make this particular sacrifice, especially because it's against his will, even though that's a plot line that pretty much comes out of nowhere. It's possible that this is the reasoning Blizzard is trying to follow, but I don't think it's a good one. In the Illidan novel, when Xe'ra shows him the power of the light and what he could become, Illidan also refuses the promise of it. But he does not refuse it because of this reason. In the novel, Illidan refuses the promise again because he thinks that something that good could never happen to someone like him. He's not regretful or anything like that, he almost wishes he could have it, but he refuses because he thinks that could never possibly happen to him. It's too good to be true. And now when he would finally be able to receive this magnificent thing that he was promised, he would refuse because it would be a sacrifice he would regret. That doesn't quite add up. I think the real reason, and it's a reason even stated out loud by Illidan after he kills Xe'ra, is that the backlash from the community to the idea of Illidan becoming a chosen one in the novel has been so great, and the community's dislike of Xe'ra as a character has been so intense that Blizzard felt they needed to do the exact opposite. And that's why I greatly dislike this moment in Illidan's story, because it does not feel like a natural development of his character, even if we're only talking about this latest version of his personality. Instead, it feels like fan service, like acquiescing to the demands of the people, of the mob, perhaps, you could say, who play the game. And honestly, I don't want to play a game where the story is dictated by the community, because it will inevitably be shallow at best and the equivalent of a stupid action flick movie at worst. But the thing that really disappoints me about this decision, this moment in Illidan's character, is that it happens and they don't do anything with it. Illidan just kills Xe'ra, Turalyon gets mad, and then almost nothing happens. No matter what you think of Xe'ra, having one of the most powerful entities in the universe be killed seems like it would deserve a bit of a reaction from the universe itself, I think. Anyway, the final moment, I suppose, of Illidan's story would be his final sacrifice to be the jailer of Sargeras. That's honestly fine and I don't have any problems with it. It fits the third version of the character, it doesn't really go with the second or the first versions, but that's not really relevant at this point. Again though, I found one of the most interesting parts of that moment to be Velen's reaction rather than Illidan himself, but I will admit that I did like this final bit and I have no complaints here. All in all then, what do I think of Illidan's character as a whole? Well, like I said, I really loved even his first portrayal, I hated his second portrayal, and I found the third portrayal to be okay, I guess, if I'm being generous. This third latest portrayal is probably the one most at odds with the first one. While the first portrayal of Illidan made him feel like a real person almost, a very relatable and rather tragic individual, this third portrayal is rather cliche, is probably the best word to describe it. Very unrelatable, I guess you could say, in contrast to the first one. About a year or so ago, I made a video detailing my favorite characters in the Warcraft universe, and Illidan made it on that list because, honestly, I was on board with the re-portrayal of the character in the Illidan novel. Sure, it's not quite as good as the original portrayal, but it was definitely better than Burning Crusade, and at that point in time, you could mix the two portrayals of Illidan together. They still coexisted rather than outright retconning one another. That video was made before Legion had even come out. Then Legion turned Illidan from either a Machiavellian anti-hero or selfish jerk, whichever you preferred, to a tinfoil hat wearing smug Shakespearean buffoon. That's a word salad if I have ever heard one. So, I suppose this is the end of this particular video. For the two people who have not completely been infuriated by what I have just said and who haven't tuned out like the others, thank you for watching. For those who have, thank you for watching as well. If you like or even love Illidan after watching this video, then good for you. My intention with this was never to indoctrinate or to convince people to accept what I'm saying. Rather, it was just to express my own thoughts and opinions and hopefully generate a positive, respectful discussion on the topic. Thank you once again, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.